Welcome to We Can Do Better, a podcast about ending poverty in our time. My name's Fran Quigley. I'm a law professor, and I go with my students every week to eviction court. There, we represent some of the millions of people in our country who are facing the loss of their homes. They also skip filling prescriptions, and some of them even go hungry, despite living in the richest nation in the world. We can do better. As you may remember from previous episodes, other countries already do far better. And in fact, the United States has often done better in the past at responding to the needs of our sisters and brothers across the communities. So our guest this week tells us that an important reason why the United States once did better was because that we had a fair taxation system, and we needed to get back to that system. Ray Madoff is a professor at Boston College Law School, where she teaches tax law and estate planning. Ray has literally written the book on the latter as the lead author of one of the top treatises on estate planning. But the book we're here to talk about today has reached a far broader audience. It is called The Second Estate: How the Tax Code Made an American Aristocracy. Here is my copy, my dog-eared copy. The Second Estate was named a Best Book of 2025 by The New Yorker. Ray has spoken about this important book in all kinds of venues, including the New York Times and NPR podcasts. She has written about the topic for The Atlantic. And to start off our conversation, I'd like to highlight two of the many passages of the book that stood out for me. This is what Ray said about the tax code. Quote, "After the Constitution, the tax code is the single most important document affecting American lives." This is what Ray said about the tax system that we have right now. Taxes on the richest Americans have become largely elective. This country has become a land of two people rather than one. Overburdened workers at all income levels carrying the lion's share of running the cost of running the country, and a growing American aristocracy of wealth and power who are allowed to abdicate their responsibilities to the nation. Ray, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Fran. It's really wonderful to be here. And thank you for the work you do with the eviction clinic. It sounds amazing.
Well, we appreciate what you're doing to help us someday maybe not have an eviction clinic, right? Some days we won't have to have thousands of people losing their homes every week. So I'd like to start off, if we can, let's start off with the title. Could you explain the historical meaning of the term the Second Estate and how that connects with our current tax system in the United States, our wealth concentration here in the United States?
Absolutely. So the Second Estate was the term for the aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France. People might remember that pre-revolutionary France was a time of massive inequality in France, the let them eat cake era, and and as we know, that didn't end too well for anybody. But the aristocracy in France at the time, everyone was a member of a distinct class. So the first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the aristocracy, and the third estate was pretty much everybody else, everybody from the bourgeoisie to the peasants. And basically the law of France was that the clergy didn't pay tax and the aristocracy didn't pay tax. They were explicitly excluded from the tax system, leaving the burden to fall on everybody else.
Wow. And so how does that connect to 2026 United States of America?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that we hear of a system like that and we think, okay, well, that's nothing like our system, right? Our tax system is one in which the greatest burdens are imposed on those with the greatest capacity to pay, right? We have a progressive income tax. We have an additional estate tax. And from its appearances, it looks like our tax system is really heavily burdening the richest Americans. But as I describe in the book, what has happened over the past 30 to 40 years is that the things have transformed to the place where, in fact, the richest Americans are able to opt out of taxes altogether. Some of them might pay a lot of taxes, right? But the thing is that for most of them, they don't have to, and it's a choice. And we might have seen that when we saw, I remember Elon Musk years ago, he was like, should I pay $11 billion in taxes, right? You and I and most of your listeners can't really ask that, right? We're not given the choice, but the wealthiest Americans are.
Right. And I'd like to ask you a little more about how that happens. I think you call it the tax avoidance playbook. But before we do that, you write in the book that it hasn't always been this way, and we kind of tease that a little bit, that we can do better. That what has been the history and the philosophy in the United States behind taxing the rich, either through income taxes or estate taxes or what have you?
Yeah. So I think it's really useful to take a quick look at the history of our modern tax system. So if we go back to the early part of the 20th century, it's interesting because the country ran pretty much on tariffs, right? So we're kind of back to the future here today
Yeah.
with Donald Trump's love of tariffs. Tariffs were pretty much the only game in town for raising revenue. And the problem with them was that they imposed their greatest burdens on farmers and consumers and anybody who needed to buy things that they were living on. They were the ones that bore the burden of taxes, and business people, people who were selling things, the wealthiest, they benefited from the system of tariffs because they were able to raise their prices without worrying about foreign competition coming in and underselling them. So people were getting high prices from both ends, both from foreign imports and from domestic providers who were all imposing higher prices. Um, the thing that was also happening at the time was this was the time that we think of as the robber baron era or the Gilded Age, right? It's the time where we had massive growth of extreme wealth on one end and extreme poverty on the other end. So this was a time where many of these richest Americans whose names are known to us today, right, like Mellon and Carnegie and many of these super rich people were, controlling the country. And they had massive wealth. And then when they died, their heirs got the property tax free. And the country, meanwhile, we had this massive group of very poor people. A lot of them were immigrants and others were American born, but they were all kind of suffering under this system of tremendous inequality. And there was a lot of concern about the future of capitalism, whether it could survive a system where there was such massive inequality. And into the system, Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest people in the world, wrote something called the Gospel of Wealth that said basically that if we're going to join the interests of the wealthy and the common man, we need to have a system that does that. And his system that he proposed was that we should have essentially a 100% tax on anybody who doesn't give their money to charity, so that people could commit their money like he did for libraries
Right.
and universities, other things. Other than that, their money should be taken away because inherited wealth was a big problem for the country. And so in response to this, and then Teddy Roosevelt, he also advocated because he too was worried about the future of capitalism. McKinley, the big tariff president, the president who said, "I'm a tariff man running on a tariff plan," right? He was killed by an anarchist. Socialism was really running rampant throughout the world. We had the Russian Revolution that went on, and capitalism had not yet established a foothold. So a lot of people became concerned that we needed to have a new system that would impose heavier tax burdens on the wealthiest Americans. And this happened in 1913, where we enacted our first modern income tax. We had had an earlier one that was found unconstitutional. We passed a constitutional amendment. And in 1913, we had the first modern income tax. Originally, it only applied to the richest 5% of Americans. Nobody else paid any taxes at all. 3 years later, we enacted a estate tax. An estate tax imposed a big tax on the transfer of wealth at death. And from that time, 1913 and 1916, through about the 1970s, these taxes grew. They became more elaborate, but they maintained a structure, which was that there would be the heaviest taxes would be imposed based on those with the greatest ability to pay. So the income tax went from only applying to the richest Americans to applying to almost all Americans to fund World War II, right? We call that the transition from a class tax to a mass tax that took place.
Okay.
But when it happened, we put in place a progressive rate structure. so that somebody who earned a lot of money would pay a higher percentage return on those later dollars than somebody who earned a little bit of money. We added on top of that an estate tax, we added a gift tax, and ultimately a generation skipping transfer tax. All of that was to fortify the taxation of inherited wealth. It was imposed at pretty high rates. At some points, it was as high as 70%. But even today, it's still imposed at 40%, which is still a pretty significant tax if it did what it was supposed to do. So we have this system, progressive income taxes, an additional estate tax, and it looks like we're all set, right? For much of the 20th century, this system was kind of doing its job. But what's happened is that since around the mid-1980s until today, there has been slow corroding of the system, undermining, in which we have created a system in which those with a lot of income, taxable income, people who work for their job, for their money, right? Whether whether they earn a very modest salary or whether they earn a big salary, they're paying plenty of taxes. But the people who aren't paying taxes are people who don't have to have a job and instead can rely on their investments and inheritances. And those are the systems where we have essentially optional taxes.
Wow. And you do a terrific job in your book about talking about, again, the law as written appears to have progressive taxation, and it did. And then just really clever people hired by really rich people have found the loopholes and found the exceptions. But Congress and the U.S. political system hasn't responded appropriately to shut those down. But you mentioned that that people are paying payroll taxes, and that definitely applies to the folks we see at eviction court. The people coming in wearing a McDonald's uniform or a home healthcare uniform, they're paying payroll taxes. But that doesn't line up with what I hear on CNBC when Jeff Bezos is interviewed, where he repeats a line that I think a lot of us have heard, is that the top 1% of earners are paying 40% of the taxes, and that 40% of Americans pay no taxes at all. So where's the disconnect between that kind of allegation and what's really happening?
Glad you brought that up. I call that the statistic that saved the rich from taxes, right? We hear this all the time. It is not just Jeff Bezos who's saying it there, but the Wall Street Journal frequently reports that on its pages and editorial pages in particular. The Washington Post in its editorial pages are now saying it, and the Economist magazine, they too have joined in stating this thing. So what is wrong with this? This is one of these statements that is true but highly misleading. So let's first start about the 40% of Americans are non-payers. Well, let's start with the top 1%, right? The top 1% are paying 40% of the taxes. That's how we often hear that statement. But actually what they're talking about is that the top 1% of earners are paying 40% of all income taxes. Okay. And people think, well, top earners, that must be Zuckerberg, Musk, Bezos, Buffett, right? All these guys, Larry Ellison, right?
Right.
Because how else would they have become the richest people in the world, you know? But the answer is that when you actually look at their salaries, they are shockingly modest. Like the highest paid one is Warren Buffett. He makes $100,000, which isn't bad, right? But not what you'd expect for the greatest stock picker of all time, right? And that is his combined salary and bonus was never to be higher than $100,000.
Wow.
Jeff Bezos, $82,000, an amount that was so low that he was actually eligible for the child care tax credit, which he took. So he regularly will not take more than $82,000 in salary. And even as modest as that is, it's huge compared to all these other guys who are simply dollar a year guys, right? Zuckerberg and Ellison and Brin and all of these people, they're dollar a year guys. They don't take a salary at all. Now, you might think, well, that's because, they really care and they don't want to hurt their company. It's like, no, it's because they know that, as we say, salaries are for suckers. Salaries are subject to very heavy taxes. So somebody earning $60,000, right? Somebody who might end up in your in the courts with your students are helping them. Someone who earns $60,000 pays $13,000 in taxes. If they're a self-employed person, let's say they're an Uber driver or a delivery person, right? They pay $13,000 just in federal taxes, and most of those are payroll taxes. That $13,000 for someone who's trying to get by on $60,000 is really it's quite burdensome, right? It can easily make the difference between whether or not they can afford their rent or their food or their medicine, right? It's a big, hefty chunk of that money, and almost all of it is attributable to payroll taxes. So when we say that 40% of Americans pay no taxes at all, that's simply not true. When you actually calculate, when you add in payroll taxes, the number is like 17%, which is also the number of people over the age of 70. So
Wow.
this idea of non-payers, you often hear this, right? They're Republicans like Mitt Romney. These are takers, not makers, right? That is not true. And then the other canard for low-income people is that somehow payroll taxes aren't really taxes, right? They're kind of hidden taxes because they show up. They look like they're called contributions on our pay stubs, right? Making it seem like something we can either choose to do or not do, or like it's future saving for our own retirement. But that's not what it is at all. Actually, money that is current people today paying payroll taxes are paying the Social Security of current retirees. This is a tax just like any other tax. And there's no assurance that anybody who's paying these taxes today is ever going to get any benefit from them, right? I mean, hopefully our Social Security system will be there. Hopefully they'll live long enough to benefit from them. But there's been all sorts of cases of people who lost their benefits, either for any number of reasons, and they had no legal right to claim them. So they are not a personal saving.
Yeah.
So now go to the other side so now we have the top 1%, right? That they are supposedly paying all the taxes, but they in fact are just as likely to be in the 40% of non-payers, only true non-payers, right? Rather than in the greatest payers because they don't take salaries. So anyway, so that's how that statistic really confuses people.
No, I appreciate that. And you mentioned salaries are for suckers. You know, our clients, again, who are working, who are on the risk of losing their homes, and FICA is very real to them, right? This is not a hidden tax for them. They understand that the whole question is, what am I supposed to be paid, and what's my take home pay? And that is oftentimes the difference between somebody being able to stay housed or not is how much taxation is happening to them that apparently Jeff Bezos and others are saying doesn't happen at all. So I appreciate you correcting the record.
And if you're self-employed, you have to pay both halves of that. So it's 15.3%. And then for people who are employed by others, economists generally think that the employees are still suffering that because they actually have lower wages than they would get if their employer weren't paying the payroll taxes. So it's falling on employees in every different way.
Yeah. Well, when you mentioned a little bit about how, they're Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg, et cetera, aren't making their money through salaries, yet they also aren't paying a lot of taxes. So you talk about the tax avoidance playbook, which I think I saw one interview where somebody said, aren't you giving the game away? And some of these rich people are going to now know how to avoid taxes. I think your answer was they already very much know how to avoid taxes. So what are the ways that they avoid taxes?
Okay. So the first way, as I mentioned, is they don't take salaries, right? They're not taking high salaries. And I'd say the only exception might be some of these private equity guys, right? But of course they have their own game where they are pretending that their salaries are capital returns and they're claiming them as capital gains. But that's a whole separate story. Okay. So generally speaking, our richest Americans don't take a salary, but what they do instead is they rely on the growing value of their stock. And this growth is enormous, right? Just from like 2023, just looking over the past 3 years, many of them have had their wealth grow in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is really extraordinary, right? Massive amounts of wealth is growing. And the thing is, under our current rules, there is no assurance that anybody will ever pay tax on this growth in value of property. Because under our rules, you only pay taxes if you sell the property. And if you don't sell the property, you don't pay taxes on it. So if you give it away or you pass it at death, no taxes are paid. This is unlike the rule in Canada, where whenever property is transferred, right, not just by sale, but also by gift or at death, then the gains are tallied and people have to pay tax on those gains. But we don't have that rule here. And as a result, people don't have to pay taxes on their property if they don't sell it. Now, listeners might think, well, yeah, but if they don't sell it, how are they going to enjoy their lavish lifestyle? And the answer is that if you are a very rich person, people are very happy to give you a loan, right? Your loans, you have a lot of security to offer for the loan, so nobody's worrying about being paid back. And so people are able to borrow money at tremendous terms, and that's what they live off of. And so lots and lots of our richest Americans have just borrowed for everything. I mean, I'd say,
I think you mentioned Larry Ellison in the book.
yeah,
It's just a remarkable amount of debt, but people are happy to loan to him.
absolutely. And what's amazing is that, the book was written before he pledged even more shares to acquire Paramount, just as a little aside. Yeah, that was just when he was buying islands and all sorts of other things, So basically, there's a lot of borrowing that goes on, and that borrowing is entirely tax-free. It's not a taxable event.
Wow. But you say they're kicking the can down the road, but I believe that the phrase is buy, borrow, die. So what about that third stage of dying? How can they avoid taxes by dying?
Yeah. So there is a little additional benefit, but so the benefit is that when people pass on property at death, their heirs get the property as if they bought it for fair market value. So this thing is called or sometimes called the angel of death loophole. And it's a great benefit, and it wipes away a lot of gains. The thing is that is this angel of death loophole, step up in basis. It's something that you hear politicians talk about a lot, and it really is something that should be closed, should be eliminated. But where all the action happens in the estate, where people are able to be avoiding taxes, what they're doing is they're doing gifting, and there they don't get step up in basis. So you don't need step up in basis in order to avoid taxes. All you need is for your heirs to be able to borrow as well, which they can.
And I want to ask you about where we are with the estate tax, and I think you've mentioned even calling it almost a voluntary tax because it's so easily avoided. But again, as we talked about it hasn't always been this way. And you spend some time in your book talking about the kind of the PR campaign and the political campaign that changed or really defanged the estate tax. Can you talk a little bit about what happened and how that was sold?
It's probably going to be surprising to a lot of your listeners, but prior to 1990, the estate tax was a very well accepted sort of, innocuous tax. It was something that people understood, and it applied to the richest 1% to 2% of Americans on their when they passed on property during life or at death. It was a pretty well-maintained tax. So, for example, in 1976 and then again in 1986, Congress enacted something called the generation skipping transfer tax to make sure people couldn't avoid the estate tax by creating multi-generational trusts. And then 4 years later in 1990, Congress enacted these rules because people were gaming valuation, and they said, no, you can't game valuation. And they enacted they're called special valuation rules, and they were designed to avoid gaming. And both of these pretty significant loophole closing projects, they were both enacted under Republican presidents, right? This was just a regular bipartisan revenue raising, fairness preserving tax that everyone accepted. However, beginning in the early 1990s, 18 of the country's richest families, the Mars family, the Kochs, the Waltons, A lot of these famous families that we know, famous rich families, got together to advocate for repeal of the estate tax. But they knew it wouldn't look very good if they were the face of the estate tax, right? If they're just a bunch of rich people going like, we don't want to pay estate taxes, right? Nobody would be, that wouldn't be too effective. And so they did something very clever. First thing they did is they hired this guy, Frank Luntz, who was a tremendously powerful wordsmith. And he told them to stop calling it the estate tax because that sounds like something that applies to rich people, and instead call it the death tax, because that's something that sounds like it comes for everyone, like death, right? Sounds ominous. It's disturbing. It will work to turn people against it. And so, I suspect you could pretty much stop anybody on the street today and say, what is that tax? What do they call it? And they would say it's a death tax and it's an unfair double tax that hurts family farms and businesses, right? It's a phenomenally successful campaign. Because the other thing that they did is that rather than the rich people advocating for themselves, they got a collection of business people, family farmers. That was sort of the most appealing look. Because remember, the country, one of the reasons that people were so disturbed by the excesses of the Gilded Age was because the country had always had a self-image as being a place made up of farmers and small business people, right? And so those were the people they got to advocate to repeal the estate tax, to say, we're afraid of the estate tax. And the most effective spokesperson was this fellow by the name of Chester Thigpen, who was the grandson of slaves and who had a Christmas tree farm. And he said, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my whole farm because of the death tax is going to come and my family won't get it and everything will be sold for timber. And of course he was afraid because their campaign was so effective that everybody saw advertisements, and it was, so people became afraid, and this guy was afraid. He was so effective. He testified in Congress many times about his fear, and he was so effective that Republicans wanted to call it the Chester Thigpen Relief Act.
Oh my goodness.
To repeal the estate tax. Okay, so Chester Thigpen actually did die. And when he died, it turns out that his estate wasn't subject to tax at all because it was way too small. It fit well within the exemption amount. So we actually have lots of provisions in our code to address the problem of family farms and businesses. But it was such an effective thing for the wealthy families to use that that's what they used to advocate for repeal of the estate tax. And this campaign was tremendously effective, not just in terms of changing people's perceptions, but there was one year when there was no estate tax at all. And even when Obama was elected and the estate tax was due to come back with full force, he made the exemption amounts even larger and the rates even smaller because Republicans and Democrats were afraid to advocate for reforms to the estate tax. The bigger problem was that Congress as a whole stopped doing even basic upkeep with the tax. So the very last time there has been any changes to the tax, any closing of loopholes, was 1990. So it's now has been 36 years and no loophole closing has occurred. But meanwhile, my students and other estate planners are all, coming up with all sorts of workarounds around the estate tax. And we just have this alphabet soup of different ways of avoiding the estate tax. And we know that the estate tax, if you want proof that the estate tax does how little it does, I have two pieces of evidence for you and your listeners.
Okay, great.
The first one is that at a time when the richest Americans, at the end of 2025, the richest Americans owned $50 trillion. This is a massive amount. This is when the total federal revenue, by the way, was only $5 trillion.
Wow.
But we still had to borrow like $2 trillion because we didn't have enough to meet our $7 trillion expenses, right? Meanwhile, the richest 1% had $50 trillion of wealth. Okay. The estate tax, a flat 40% tax that was designed to apply to all transfers during life and at death. At that time, at the end of 2025, it raised $28 billion. $28 billion. Now that is 0.06%, right? Less than 0.5%. It's nothing is what it raised. And the second piece of evidence, which is even a stronger evidence, I believe, for the ineffectiveness of the estate tax, is that when we had our most recent tax bill, the One Big Beautiful Act is sometimes called, that's an entirely Republican. That was an entirely Republican bill, right? We had a Republican president, a Republican Congress, and they could have anything at all that they wanted. Note what they didn't have. No repeal of the estate tax, right? And that's because the existence of the estate tax makes it look like the rich people are paying taxes because it's right there on the books, a flat 40% tax. So everybody thinks they're paying taxes, but in fact, they're not. And furthermore, there's one other thing I wanted to say about it. The reason that it's so valuable for the wealthy people to have it is because when we have an estate tax, the income tax provides a complete giveaway for money received by gifts, inheritance, or life insurance. Where our rule is no matter how much you receive, you don't even have to tell anybody. There is an unlimited exclusion for money received by gifts, inheritances, or life insurance. So what that means is that if somebody has unemployment insurance because they've been hurt, they pay taxes on it.
Right.
Somebody gets disability benefits, they pay taxes. They pay taxes on Social Security. They pay taxes on a barter exchange, right? Everything is subject to tax, lottery winnings, prize winnings, gambling. But if you receive money by gifts, insurance, or inheritance, no tax at all, even if you get like $100 billion. So all of this exclusion from the income tax is only justified because we believe we have an estate tax, but we don't have a functioning estate tax. So that's how it happens.
Yeah, and that leads to your solution, which is counterintuitive when you first hear about it. It's like the estate tax has been gutted. The answer is not to bolster the estate tax. The answer is to get rid of the estate tax. So can you tell us how that would work?
The estate tax there's no way the estate tax is ever going to be fixed, given the amount of holes that have been poked in the tax over the years, right? So I teach my students all about how to do grats and gruts and clats and cluts and Q-perts and Q-dots and intentionally defective grantor trusts and all of these things, right? All of this alphabet soup of tax avoidance techniques. And to actually close those loopholes would involve a massive effort. And the problem is that this campaign was so effective. If Congress has never even closed a single loophole, I don't know what makes us think we're going to start closing like 40 loopholes. It's just not going to happen. But I think there's another reason, which is that the estate tax had an Achilles heel to it that made it particularly vulnerable. And that is that the tax is imposed on the person who died. Right. And so now for some people, they'll never have paid taxes on it, right? Because they'll have acquired massive amounts of stock and the stock will have grown in value and they'll never have paid taxes on it. But other people can think of like Paul McCartney, right? Or J.K. Rowling, right? They've acquired their wealth through taxable means. They have royalties. They have other forms of income. And so they've paid a lot of taxes and now they die and we're saying, oh, now you're subject to taxes again, right? That does feel like a double tax to people because they've paid taxes once and now you're dead and now we're going to kick you when you're down and we're going to pay another tax. Because missing from the picture, most people aren't aware of all this giveaway in the income tax system. And so what I think we need to do is we need to get rid of the estate tax with its Achilles heel, and we need to actually impose the tax where it belongs, which is the person who's being given this money. We should decide how much people should be able to inherit tax-free. Maybe it's $1 million. Maybe we want to subsidize $1 million of inheritance and say that much should be tax-free. But after that, people should pay taxes on it, just as they do all their other forms of acquiring income.
The live people, not the dead people, the second
Exactly.
generation. Yeah.
But
Which you would think
whoever
politically would be, we're not as sympathetic to somebody who didn't earn the money, who just earned the money by being
Right.
born into the right family, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that transparency, you say, could have some value as well. It's just that if we do right now, as you said, we don't know when they don't have to report it at all. So massive amounts of money is being transferred, and we don't know anything about it. If we do tax it as to the recipient, then we'd know something. We'd know what kind of wealth is out there that's being passed around, right?
That's right.
Yeah. You do a great job in the book, and you can tell that you're a teacher because you have this wonderful comparison between an Uber driver and how they're paying payroll taxes, as you mentioned, and paying on the salary, et cetera, and they're being taxed versus an Uber investor. And Uber drivers are our clients. We have lots of ride-sharing clients and drivers who unfortunately are facing eviction. But we don't see a lot of investors. As you mentioned, the investors are going to be in that category of folks who don't, who can kick the can down the road and then potentially even pass it in an estate and never be taxed at all.
That's right.
What other fixes would you have besides the actual just getting rid of the estate tax and getting the and taxing the transfers that way?
Right. So the two things that I would do is if we recognize that the problem with our system is not earners, the problem our system is investments and inheritances, then I see the answers as investments and inheritances, right? So we should ensure that when somebody has enjoyed gains of property, again, over a certain exemption amount, we can decide, people can have a house that's gone up $1 million, whatever it is we want to protect. But in excess of that, we should tally those gains when a person dies and impose taxes then, or when they give the property away. Whenever the person transfers property, we should adopt that Canadian rule that says the transfer of property is the time where you pay taxes on those gains. And that way, we make sure that these people that have been able to live off of this wealth will actually pay taxes on that wealth. Otherwise, they won't. And then the other is for the people who inherit wealth, that they should pay taxes on the wealth that they inherit in excess of an exemption amount. And the other thing, by the way, that I would do is if you have a system like this, then you can have your exemptions for things that we maybe want to have an exemption for. Like, for example, if we care about family farms and businesses, we can have an exemption for family farms and businesses, but we have to be honest about what it means for something to be a family business. But what we meant by a family business is somebody's livelihood. It's not the Mars family sitting around enjoying the growth of the value of their Mars stock. That is not the type of family business that we need to be protecting. That's a dynasty. And dynasties have long been a source of tremendous concern for this country.
Yeah. And you would think that wouldn't resonate the way death tax. We're concerned about death tax. We're concerned about Mr. Thigpen or somebody who owns the Main Street drugstore losing the store and the transfer between generations. So, well, I want to say that this book is terrific. And this book, actually, there's topics we did not address, which means you should need to go out and buy this book. The Second Estate, we didn't talk about the charitable tax deduction. We didn't talk about Ray's views on the wealth tax proposals in California and other places, but I want to be respectful of your time, especially it's the second week of classes. Is that right? It is.
Yeah.
It's a busy time. We law professors actually have to work this time of year. So, so Ray, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and thank you so much for your work. Again, on behalf of the people who right now can't get access to social services and housing services, et cetera, because we don't have the funding because all of this tax avoidance is happening and the Second Estate is being written out of the tax code. So thank you for your writing and your research and your teaching, but also your advocacy. So very much appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Fran. This was fantastic. I look forward to listening to your other episodes.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for listening to this. And remember, please, we can do better.